The shocking truth behind the Roman army's food, the marble and mythology, Rome's legions ran on food, and not very exciting food. Think of the modern army cliché of an army marches on its stomach. The Romans took that literally, but they also made it dull. Barley porridge was the baseline. Wheat was better, but was sometimes withheld as a punishment. Imagine being thousands of miles from home, armed to the teeth, conquering provinces. And your biggest treat is a slightly different grain. Their standard ration looked something like this: about a kilogram of grain a day, a splash of sour wine, a pinch of salt, and whatever the quartermaster could scrounge in terms of beans, cheese, or dried fruit. Meat, contrary to Hollywood, was rare. It spoiled quickly, and fresh meat was usually linked to sacrifice, not to supper. Salt pork or dried sausage might show up, but the ordinary legionary mostly chewed on bread so hard it could double as a weapon. Naturally, they made it worse by carrying the raw grain themselves. Each soldier lugged a handmill on his back, ground his own rations, and baked his own bread. It was a clever way to reduce baggage trains, but it meant every evening turned into a sort of grim bake-off. You finish marching 20 miles in full kit, and then you kneel down to grind flour. Not exactly the life of glory promised on the recruitment tablet. Even the wine had a catch. It was posca, sour wine mixed with water and sometimes herbs or vinegar. It kept better than straight water and probably killed a few microbes, but the taste was not what you'd call celebratory. Roman soldiers became so used to it that later writers mocked them as vinegar drinkers. They wore it as a badge of ruggedness, but you can almost hear the collective sigh at each evening pour. The officers ate differently, of course. A centurion's mess might include better bread, imported olives, and a little meat. Higher up the ladder, the tribunes and legates dined on what looked much more like aristocratic Roman cuisine: spiced fish sauce, roasted birds, sweet cakes. This wasn't just comfort, it reinforced hierarchy. Your plate literally told you where you stood, and there were punishments hidden in the menu. Being relegated from wheat to barley was a standard penalty for minor offenses. Barley was considered fit for animals, so when a cohort was barleyed, as one writer put it, everyone knew they'd done something wrong. In an age without written reprimands, your food did the scolding. Let's drift for a moment to a campaign in northern Britain. Rain slicks the leather tents. The soldiers are wet, cold, and far from their Mediterranean home. In the cooking pits, thin porridge bubbles. A few sprigs of local herbs have been tossed in, more out of boredom than culinary daring. Somewhere a young legionary writes to his family, describing the endless gray and the even grayer meals. He leaves out the part about foraging for acorns. But food wasn't just sustenance. It was also ritual. Grain from a newly conquered region might be ground and offered in sacrifice before the army ate it. The first drink of posca might be poured out for the gods. This tied their diet into the broader pattern of Roman religious life, a life where nothing was entirely mundane. There were bright spots. On campaign, when supplies allowed, soldiers supplemented their diet by hunting, fishing, or buying from camp followers. Archaeologists find traces of oysters, game birds, even exotic spices at some sites. These weren't daily fare, but little bursts of variety. You can almost see the faces around the fire when someone produced a jar of honey or a hunk of cheese from home. And as for marching rations, the Romans were practical. Hardtack biscuits, dried figs, and blocks of compressed grapes. One could last for weeks. Modern hikers would recognize some of these as proto-energy bars. Dense, unappetizing, but efficient. Soldiers joked about them, but they kept moving. It's also worth noting how food defined identity. Legionaries from one region brought their tastes into the army, blending them with others. A Syrian archer's stew might smell very different from a Gaulish auxiliary's. Over time, these mingled into a sort of pan-Roman soldier cuisine, simple, salty, heavy on grain and sour wine, with whatever local flavor could be scavenged. If all this sounds bleak, it's partly the point. The Roman army's diet was designed to be uniform, predictable, and just nutritious enough. Luxury was a distraction. Even taste could be a discipline. When later writers praised the iron stomachs of Roman soldiers, they were admiring not just endurance, but conformity. So as you lie there listening, picture the legions not as a faceless machine, but as thousands of individuals grinding grain at dusk, boiling porridge, sharing a joke over a chipped bowl of posca. That's the unglamorous engine behind the empire. And with that image in mind, let's gently drift toward the next part of the story. how these food habits weren't just about survival, but about control, hierarchy, and a very Roman idea of virtue. Why? Roman legionaries consumed nearly a kilo of grain every day. So, still picturing those rows of tents and the soft clatter of hand mills, let's drift a little closer to the question everyone eventually asks. Why on earth were Roman soldiers eating almost a kilo of grain every single day? That's not a typo. The official ration hovered right around 850 grams to a full kilogram of wheat, sometimes more if supplies were good. In modern terms, that's several big loaves of bread's worth of calories before you even add the beans or cheese. Part of the answer is simple. Grain stores well. You can march it, sack it, tax it, and ship it without it turning into a rotting mess. For a sprawling empire where legions might be weeks away from a supply depot, grain was the only truly reliable staple. Dried meat spoils, fresh meat dies on the hoof, but a bag of wheat kernels just sits there waiting to be ground. Another part of the answer is cultural. Romans had a deep, almost religious respect for grain. The goddess Ceres presided over it. Distributing grain was one of the key duties of magistrates back in the city. Bread literally defined Roman citizenship. When you gave soldiers grain, you weren't just feeding them, you were reaffirming their place as Roman men under Roman discipline. And of course, there's the energy. A legionary on the march burned thousands of calories a day. He carried his weapons, armor, cooking kit, and at least a few days' worth of food on his own shoulders. He dug trenches, built roads, raised palisades. He was a builder as much as a fighter. You can almost hear a quartermaster muttering, "Give them more grain, they'll need it." Naturally, the army found a way to make even this practical necessity into a moral lesson. Wheat was considered the food of free men. Barley was for animals and the punished. If you were caught slacking or mutinying, your wheat rotted up in bad. Shin could be swapped for barley, a culinary demotion everyone noticed. In this way, the daily kilo of grain became not only sustenance, but a badge of standing. And there's the arithmetic. That kilo of wheat wasn't eaten raw. The soldier ground it into flour, mixed it with water, and baked or boiled it. Depending on the preparation, that might yield a dense loaf, a flat cake, or a thick porridge. Combined with beans, lentils, and the odd splash of olive oil, it formed a complete, if monotonous, diet. You can picture them at dusk, stirring a pot of pulse, the standard Roman porridge, while swapping stories about home. There was also a logistical trick hidden in plain sight. By issuing raw grain rather than baked bread, the army cut down on spoilage and central baking facilities. Each man became his own baker. The army didn't need to transport finished loaves that would go stale. It just handed out sacks of grain and let the soldiers do the rest. Crude, but effective. And then there's the simple truth that Roman soldiers were not just consumers of empire. They were also its farmers on the move. Many had grown up on small plots, grinding grain, kneading dough, tending a fire. These weren't exotic chores. They were a return to normality, a routine in the middle of conquest. In a strange way, that kilo of grain was a tiny anchor to everyday life. When supplies ran thin, the ration shrank or changed, but the ideal remained. A man on full grain rations was a man in a functioning army. A man on half rations was an omen of trouble. In campaign diaries and letters, you can trace morale by what's in the pot. Even the officers' meals circled back to this base. Yes, they had more variety, more meat, perhaps a few imported delicacies. But their bread was still there. Their porridge still bubbled. The kilo of grain underpinned not just nutrition, but identity, the shared taste of Rome itself. So as you settle deeper into your blanket, imagine that steady rhythm of scooping, grinding, and kneading. 1,000 men, each with the same rations, each making the same food. It's repetitive, but it's also unity. The empire was built on that sameness as much as on discipline and iron. And with that image drifting in your mind, we can gently move to the next part of the story. How this humble, heavy ration shaped everything from camp routines to battlefield endurance. How soldiers turned raw grain into porridge, hardtack, or sourdough-like bread. So, with nearly a kilo of raw wheat tucked into their rations, the question becomes, what exactly did Roman legionaries do with it? After all, no one is crunching through handfuls of raw kernels unless they're very desperate or very drunk. And given that wine was often watered down, they probably weren't quite drunk enough for that particular experiment. The standard answer is porridge. The Romans called it pulse. You take the wheat, grind it, or more realistically, smash it with a hand mill until it vaguely resembles flour. Then boil it in water until it reaches that liminal state between soup and paste. If you were lucky, you might toss in a few beans, an onion, or a splash of oil. If you were unlucky, you just ate the paste. Soldiers ate so much of this mush that Roman authors casually described them as porridge eaters. Not exactly the most glorious nickname for the conquerors of the Mediterranean, but accurate. Now, when a legionary had a little more time, he could make bread, not the fluffy, bakery-style loaves you might be picturing, but dense, sour, and flat, because of course, they didn't have little packets of instant yeast tucked into their tunics. Instead, the dough was left to sit, catching wild yeast from the air. In other words, accidental sourdough. This made the bread heavier, tangier, and sometimes vaguely brick-like. Perfect, really, for long marches, and for doubling as a weapon if the situation got desperate. And then there was the infamous hardtack, essentially flour.
Ader, and heat until it hardened into something closer to pottery than pastry. It could last for months, which was the whole point. Soldiers gnawed on it, softened it in wine, or broke it into stews. Some pieces probably survived longer than the campaigns they were carried on. Archaeologists have found ancient examples still intact. Imagine a biscuit so durable that 2 millennia later, it looks ready to chip your teeth today. That was Roman hardtack. Cooking, though, was always part of the ritual of soldiering. Each contubernarium, a group of 8 men who shared a tent, cooked together. They pooled their grain, ground it, baked or boiled it, and ate from the same pot. It wasn't just about eating, it was about bonding, about creating a tiny household inside the marching machine of Rome. Picture 8 tired men hunched around a small fire, the same porridge steaming, the same bread cracking between their teeth. That sameness was as much a weapon as their gladius. Of course, monotony was inevitable. No amount of onions or oil could disguise the fact that most meals were just different shades of grain. One day mushy, the next day dense, the next day tooth-breaking. Even the wine was often mixed into it, not for taste, but to make stale hardtack vaguely edible. Culinary variety was not the strong suit of the Roman army, but the simplicity worked. It fueled marches, sieges, and battles. Grain may not be glamorous, but it was relentless. And here's the curious part. Despite its dullness, this food was still better than what many peasants back home survived on. A legionary at least had guaranteed rations. He knew his kilo of wheat was coming. The villager outside the empire's walls did not. So, in its own grim way, the porridge pot was a perk of military life. So, when you picture the Roman army, the gleaming armor, the drills, the thunder of marching feet, don't forget this quieter image. Men grinding grain, boiling porridge, chewing sour bread, and gnawing on hard. It was also built on bowls of hot mush and very sore jaws. And with that thought, let's drift a little further into how these daily food rituals shaped the culture of the legions, and why sharing a pot of porridge could matter just as much as sharing a shield. The vinegar-based sports drink of the ancients. Settle back again and picture our weary legionaries, dusty, sunburned, and probably smelling faintly of boiled barley, pausing on the roadside to swig what might be history's first electrolyte drink. It wasn't Gatorade, it wasn't even wine. It was posca, a humble, sour blend of vinegar, water, and a pinch of whatever herbs or salt the quartermaster had lying around. Imagine a thin vinaigrette without the salad. That was the refreshment of an empire. This was not a punishment drink, despite what it sounds like. Ordinary soldiers were rarely issued decent wine. That was for officers and dignitaries. Vinegar, however, was cheap, transportable, and, in the days before germ theory, oddly practical. Mixed with water, the acid killed some of the bacteria that lurked in Roman wells and cisterns. So while it may have puckered their lips, it probably saved a few stomachs. Posca also had a faintly reviving effect. The sourness stimulated saliva, making the drink feel more quenching than plain water. It may have offered trace minerals from the vinegar fermentation itself, tiny amounts of potassium, perhaps a whisper of magnesium. Legionaries weren't thinking in those terms, of course. They just knew it was safe, available, and stopped the thirst. And because it was made from the leftovers of wine production, basically the Roman version of factory seconds, it cost next to nothing. We have a few literary snapshots of it. Pliny the Elder, the encyclopedic collector of everything under the sun, notes its popularity among the lower classes. Cato the Elder, who was always trying to appear tougher and thriftier than everyone else, recommended it as a standard ration. In some garrisons, it was flavored with a little honey, or crushed coriander, or even sea salt if you were feeling fancy. But mostly, it was just sour water. There's a small irony here. The elite Romans sneered at posca as a drink for peasants and soldiers. Yet today, shrub cocktails and apple cider tonics are sold at upscale wellness bars for $10 a shot. The legionary trudging through Gaul with a leather flask of vinegar water might have been centuries ahead of the trend. And of course, the vinegar drink became a small social marker. A centurion or tribune, lounging under an awning, might be sipping a diluted wine, fragrant and faintly sweet. His men, squatting on their haunches in the dust, tipped up their skins of posca, 2 beverages, 1 army, a gentle reminder of the ranks. If you're imagining the taste and wrinkling your nose, you're not alone. Ancient writers occasionally joke about its sharpness, yet it clearly did its job. Legionaries marched 20 miles on it, built roads, and fought battles under a Mediterranean sun. They even brought the habit home. In some regions, peasants and shepherds kept drinking vinegar water well into the Middle Ages. Like many Roman practices, it lingered quietly, long after the legions were gone. So, when you see a modern bottle of bright blue sports drink on a gym bench, remember the Roman soldier with his humble skin of posca. Different color, same idea. A cheap, portable way to keep going when the work is endless. Sour refreshment marching through history. Let's drift now to another corner of the legionary diet, the things they cooked up when they were allowed to linger in camp a little longer. The truth about their meat rations, and what was considered a punishment food. So far we've wandered through grains and sour drinks. Now let's drift into something that sounds more exciting. Meat. Except, this being the Roman army, it's less barbecue on the march, and more, occasionally, if the logistics gods smile, you'll get a scrap. Roman legionaries weren't on a steak and eggs plan. Their daily ration was overwhelmingly grain, because it was cheap, lightish to transport, and didn't spoil in a week. Meat was technically part of the official supply list, but in practice, it appeared irregularly, like a surprise cameo in a dull play. Salt pork or bacon might show up on long campaigns, dried or smoked so it wouldn't rot. Fresh beef was rarer, usually slaughtered from pack animals, no longer fit for marching. Soldiers knew this and didn't necessarily look forward to it. Old pack animal beef is not exactly the stuff of culinary dreams. Fish was more common than you might think, dried, salted, or pickled, shipped in barrels from coastal towns to wherever the army was encamped. Garum, the famous fermented fish sauce, was sometimes ladled over bland porridge to make it vaguely interesting. It worked if you liked your dinner to smell like a Roman fish market at low tide. And then there was what the sources hint at as punishment food. Legionaries who fell foul of discipline could have their normal ration cut or replaced with something symbolic of shame, often barley instead of wheat. That might sound trivial, but to a Roman soldier, it was a public demotion. Barley was feed for animals and the poor. To be handed a bag of it instead of your usual wheat was like being sent to the kids' table. Everyone knew. Everyone smirked. Some writers describe an even more meager ration in extreme cases. A handful of raw beans or plain water. Not enough to starve, just enough to make a man's be. Ellie grumbled while he reflected on his sins. Roman discipline prized humiliation as much as pain. Even the food could tell you where you stood. Officers and centurions, of course, did rather better. They had servants, mess tents, and the means to purchase extra delicacies from local markets. Cheese, olives, a jug of tolerable wine. The rank and file looked on and chewed their barley. This contrast reinforced the hierarchy as surely as the stripes on a tunic. There's a quiet irony here. Modern reenactors of Roman soldiers often post pictures of roasted meat over campfires. It looks heroic. In reality, a soldier's mess kit was more likely to hold grain paste with a drizzle of fish sauce and maybe a shred of salt pork if it had been a good day. The true taste of empire was thrift. So when we imagine the legions stamping across Europe and the Near East, it's worth remembering what fueled them. Not endless meat banquets, not glamorous feasts, but porridge, sour vinegar water, and, if you misbehaved, a sad sack of barley, a diet as disciplined as the men themselves. Let's drift now, still in that camp at twilight, to the little things they did to make this monotonous food at least somewhat edible. Herbs, local ingredients, and improvised cooking tricks that turned army rations into something resembling dinner. Why a Roman soldier valued a loaf of bread more than a paycheck. Hey everyone, still awake? Let's drift a little further into the camp. It's the hour when the fires are low, helmets are stacked, and you can smell the faint sourness of yesterday's bread. In that quiet, you begin to see why. For an ordinary legionary, a humble loaf meant more than the coins he was technically earning. On parchment, pay in the Roman army looked respectable. Augustus set a basic wage. Later emperors increased it. But pay was a slippery thing. Out of it came deductions for clothing, equipment, and even the right to sleep under the unit's tent. Some soldiers ended a campaign owing more than they'd been issued. The silver denarius that jingled in the purse was more a promise than a reality. Bread, on the other hand, was immediate. You could hold it, smell it, eat it before dawn march. A loaf meant strength in your legs and calm in your stomach. It meant you could actually get through another day of building roads, erecting palisades, or standing watch on some misty frontier. Soldiers quickly learned that coins didn't keep you warm and fed. Bread did. It was a direct line between survival and the empire's logistics. This is why grain rations became almost a kind of parallel currency inside the camp. Men traded portions of their wheat for favors, dice games, or extra wine. Bakers inside the legion, often the more experienced hands, could make a tidy side income by turning everyone else's grain into edible loaves. A well-baked round of sour, chewy bread was more welcome than another handful of tarnished coinage. If you had bread, you could barter for almost anything. If you only had pay, you might still go hungry. There was also a deeper psychological comfort. Bread connected legionaries back to the farms of Italy or Gaul, to family kitchens, to a sense of normal life. In a world of marching orders and distant provinces, that small loaf was continuity. It was a reminder that even as the empire's machine ground on, they were still human beings who broke bread at dusk. Officers, of course, drew higher pay and could supplement their rations with luxuries. But even they understood the symbolism. When generals wanted to calm mutiny, they distributed food before money. Grain shipments arriving on time meant more to morale than any pay increase. As one historian dryly notes, an army marches on its stomach, not on its payroll. So in the flickering light of a campfire, you see a legionary cutting into his ration loaf with a dull knife, steam rising from the crumb. He looks at his little leather purse of coins, shrugs, and pushes it aside. Tomorrow the purse might be empty, but if there's still bread, he'll march. And that, softly, is why a Roman soldier valued a loaf more than a paycheck. It was tangible, nourishing, and immediate, in a way imperial bureaucracy never could be. Coins were a promise. Bread was real.